For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started. All right, looks like we are live on Standing for Truth. And I want to thank everybody for their patience. I've been incredibly excited for this specific program all week since we announced it. We've got Professor David McQueen back with us here today. It's always a treat and an honor. So, Professor McQueen, thank you so much for being back with us on the program tonight. Definitely starting at a different time. But this is definitely going to be one to remember nonetheless. We've got a young Earth creationist best friend. We are going to be discussing diamonds and how they provide essentially overwhelming evidence for young Earth creation. So before I introduce Professor McQueen and our amazing award-winning co-host, George Bond, I just want to go over a couple announcements here. We've got a really, really busy March planned. Tomorrow, we've got a debate on morality. We've got Matt Slick back here with us debating Derek Barnes. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Make sure you're here. You're not going to want to miss out on that debate. That kicks off at 9:30 EST. Also this week, we've got John McKay, the creation guy, back with us. This will be on Friday, and we've had him here before about a month or two ago. So definitely check out that interview if you have not yet seen it. That's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have a question and answer as well. So please bring your questions pertaining to flood geology, creation, evolution, so on and so forth. Later on in the month, we've got some really exciting debates and discussions. One specifically with Professor McQueen. We've got Bill Morgan back on as well, and a few others that I'm just confirming some exact days and times for. So I'll announce those when I get those confirmed. Anyways, enough for me. You didn't come here to hear me. You came here to see Professor McQueen and the topic of diamonds. So Professor McQueen, I'll unmute you.
Hi,
thank you so much.
There we go. I saw that my mic was muted, and according to my screen, George's mic is muted also. So I want him to be able to talk here in a minute. George, hello. How are you doing?
Hello, David. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever it is in your part of the world, to everyone in the audience.
Yes, and what we're going to do tonight is the first 30 minutes, I'm going to take 15 minutes talking about the geology of diamond kimberlite pipes. George is going to take 15 minutes starting our discussion about carbon-14 in diamonds. Then we're going to take 30 minutes of question and answers. We'll come back after the 1 hour break and go in more depth into the very fascinating and very fine, accurate argument for finding carbon-14 in diamonds, which, as you will see as we go on, it's absolutely remarkable. But how could we begin, George, without you telling a joke?
You're right, David. You're reading my mind. Let's see. Which one should I tell you? Oh, yeah.
So many to choose from.
Did you know marriage is like a deck of cards?
Oh, how is that? Shuffling them, I guess?
No, at the start you need a diamond and a heart. But
Yeah.
at the end, unfortunately, you need a club and a spade.
Now that is funny. You don't always say something that's funny, but that's funny.
You top yourself every time, George.
I love it. Okay. I'm limiting myself to 15 minutes here. So let's begin on the topic of the geology of diamonds. Now, as George and I have talked about this over the last 2 weeks, I have studied in some detail the geology of one very famous mine in South Africa that is called the Kimberley Diamond Mine. It is known as the Big Hole. And the reason it's called that is it can actually be seen from the International Space Station. And it's a man-made hole that was dug beginning a little bit past 1850 all the way up to the birth of my parents in 1914 in South Africa. The thing, George, is amazing. It's over 200 meters deep, dug by hand, dug by shovels. People going out and looking there. Why would they do that? Because diamonds were discovered there in the 1800s, and it started an enormous rush. And so the geology of the area, at least superficially, has been studied now since probably at least 1870. So we're pretty close to being 150 years worth of study on this location. And as I got into it and began to study it in more detail, I realized that even for someone that's a scientist like Brother George, it would take the entire 2 hours to go into full details about what a kimberlite pipe is. So I'm going to use some very simple examples to illustrate how extraordinarily complicated these rocks are. I've been working with Andrew Snelling on a rough draft of a book of mine dealing with rocks for children. Many of you know that I've got a book that deals with minerals for children. And while working on this, Dr. Andrew Snelling and I, who's going to come up more in our discussions because of his work on the RATE program and also the big book that he wrote, Earth's Catastrophic Past, he and I have thought, well, maybe we need a fourth kind of rock. So let's go back to school. We've got igneous rocks, sedimentary rocks, metamorphic rocks, but we're suggesting that there's a fourth category. Andrew and I both have professional training in mine geology, in the exploration for copper, lead, zinc, in my case, uranium and other things in Andrew's case. And so if we go to these four categories, I thought I would begin very simply. But what I discovered was this: the types of igneous rock in which diamonds are found are given a variety of names. They're called kimberlite dikes. They're called kimberlite pipes. They're called lamphophyre dikes. Do you see the area on the left-hand side of your screen that I've got on the geologic map of America circled in pink? George, can you see that right there?
Yes, I do.
That area circled in pink. It turns out that's 5 hours north of where I live in the state of Arkansas, and it's the only U.S. you can go in and look for diamonds mined. It is a lamphophyre locality, and it's amazing that it would be so close to my house. So as I began to study this, the more complicated the geology and the mineralogy got. And let me illustrate it by this. One of my hobbies since my boyhood was chess. So here we have a chessboard, and this really should be black and white, but it's dark and white. If you imagine the dark squares on the chessboard as being the minerals that would be in an ordinary igneous rock, minerals like for example, quartz and feldspar, that would be the ones that show up there in the dark squares, George. But it turns out the minerals that are in kimberlites are all the white squares, and extraordinarily unique and extraordinarily complicated rocks. So I've decided to simplify things in the time I've got left here and describe these as a very unique category of igneous rock. It's certainly extrusive. Now, George, I want to teach you some extremely complicated geologic vocabulary. Are you ready?
Oh, yeah, okay. Go for it.
Okay, first say the word crack.
Crack.
And then the word boom.
Boom.
So that's the way that diamonds are formed. Here's the pennant for my alma mater, the University of Tennessee. You notice how it's triangular in shape? The way you should think about a kimberlite is that down at the level of the mantle crust boundary, a crack forms in a craton, probably a rock dating from Creation Week. So the crack forms, and then boom, at extremely high velocity, the magma comes up to the surface and forms what's called a kimberlite pipe. Now, if I move my head the other way, I hope that you can see behind me here. See if I can adjust my light. That I've got, I can take my hard hat out so we're not at the mine right now. Here's a cross section of the earth. Now you remember there's very simple, you have the crust and then the mantle and then the outer core and the inner core. Well, the kimberlites form at the depth, thank you for that. I think you can see, you got to move my hand correctly. Here's the cross section of the earth there, the crust, the mantle, the core, and so forth. Those three form the structure of the earth. Well, diamonds come from very deep within the earth. I'll take the hard hat off since we're away from the mine. I'll keep the safety vest on because we're going to get into some other complicated things. As I've thought about ways to best explain this to the Standing for Truth audience, here's an hourglass that can be used for a number of different purposes. But imagine the black sand at the bottom of the hourglass to be the crust mantle boundary. So an instability forms right where my finger is, if you can see that, right at the neck of this. And that builds up pressure, and silicate magma mixed with water and carbon dioxide, remarkably. Now, this is not from some carbonate rock. This is from the upper mantle. Boom, comes blasting up through here. And so in places like Africa and in places like Arkansas, you end up with essentially a shape that looks like this cone here, but it's inverted. And so as the magma moves up, it's expanding and blasting out and forming the kimberlite. Now, the kimberlite consists of an exotic array of rocks and minerals. So exotic, as a matter of fact, that even someone that's trained at a master's degree level like me, and even somebody that's worked as a geologist for 50 years like I have, when they're actually shown a picture of what this dike looks like in South Africa, and you can see the kimberlite dike at the pipe there at the very bottom. When you're shown that, it's blasting up in this cone-like shape so that it is a tremendous explosion. Now, we always talk about the relationship between the Bible and geology, And one thing you've heard me say before, that concerning copper and zinc, two things we've talked about, that God's grace was involved in making these materials easy to find. Well, how was this very famous mine has yielded some of the world's largest diamonds over the years, owned by De Beers, was shut down around the time my mom and dad were born in 1914. How in the world did the people first find this? Well, the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth ended up in southern Africa, and I'm sure some of them saw this odd yellow soil about the color yellow of, let me get my finger moving. You see my Post-it note there is yellow, about that color yellow. They saw this yellow color. It turns out it was made yellow by limonite oxidation right at the surface. Let me get my map back here that I was using. There we go. This is the ground surface there, George, in South Africa. And they saw this yellow, and they started digging through it, and they found these. By the way, real diamonds don't look anything like a diamond that you would put in a wedding ring when you actually find them. They have a little of a dull luster. Ms. McQueen and I have gone to this Arkansas location, circled in pink here, and we've gone 2 times looking for diamonds, never have found one. They're very, very subtle to find. But at any rate, not here. We're not talking about a few carats being found in this South African mine, but we're talking about a tremendous number of carats. As a matter of fact, George, this is an amazing detail I learned. So many carats of diamonds were found between like 1880 and 1910 that it actually depressed the price of diamonds worldwide. It flooded the market. That's amazing, isn't it, my friend?
Oh, yeah. They do that with gold too.
It's an amazing detail. So now, what is the summary of the geology of this? The summary of it is that the type of igneous rock from which we get diamonds is extraordinarily complicated. Again, George and I could spend 2 hours just describing the petrology, in other words, the type of rocks like lamprophyres, so forth, and the minerals that are in it, minerals that are very rich in rare earth elements, very rich in very odd chemistry. But let's keep our focus on the diamond itself. Where does the diamond come from? The diamond comes from that crust mantle boundary where there is water and CO2, as evidenced by the type of minerals that are found. The diamond is formed, the carbon comes from that CO2. Now, keep in mind that this is at the crust mantle boundary. We're not talking about 100 feet below a coal seam here. We're talking about the crust mantle boundary. Boom! Tremendous heat and pressure compresses that diamond and brings it to the surface. So for the rest of the talk, unless you want to explore it in our Q&A time, I want to put aside the geology and the mineralogy and just focus on this remarkable carbon-14 information. As it will become clear in the next hour, David McQueen, who took a class in archaeology in college, would have never dreamed in 1974, 1973, that carbon-14 could be found in a diamond at all. Absolutely phenomenal result. Let me get a sip of coffee and turn it over to George now.
Okay, thanks, David. Look, I'd like to start off with a quote I read last night by Jamie Durant. Quote, our Creator could have immediately revealed everything there is to know about his creation from the beginning, but he didn't. Could it be that he enjoys a good mystery? Perhaps he sees value in the process of scientific investigation. At the very least, it seems he created people with an innate curiosity and a desire to explore. In Scripture, it actually says, test everything, hold that which is good. So based on that introduction, I'll give you a few facts about carbon-14. Now, for every atom of carbon-14 in the atmosphere, there are an estimated 1 trillion atoms of
George,
carbon.
I'm just gonna cut you off real quick. I apologize. I've got your pictures that you sent me. Okay, so when you want me to screen share them, just let me know.
Okay, thanks, SFT.
No problem, brother.
Okay. Well, carbon-14 can be formed a number of different ways, but the main one is cosmic rays from the sun acting on the nitrogen in our atmosphere, which convert it to C14. Now, the C14 combines with the oxygen to make a carbon dioxide, if you like, a C14 version of carbon dioxide, which is absorbed by plants. Animals eat the plants. We eat the plants. We eat the animals. So we get carbon-14 in us. Now, this keeps going until you're alive. Once you die, of course, you stop taking in that carbon-14 and the carbon-14 begins to decay at a half-life of 5,730 years. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritties, okay? Reading the rate report, I've read it quite a few times now, but specifically the C14 in diamonds. C14 in diamonds is an indisputable young Earth creation evidence, and it can be measured empirically. And by the way, it's found in diamonds. Now, according to secular geology, I've heard numbers of dates and whatever, but usually it's between 1 to 3 million years it usually takes to form a diamond. Therefore, C14 in diamonds should be completely gone after at least 100,000, if not 250,000 years. We'll even give him 1 million years for the diamond to be what they call carbon-14 dead. Okay. Now we'll hear a number of rescue devices that they claim why the carbon-14 is still found in diamonds, and we'll go through some of those a little bit later. Okay.
Yes.
One of the most amazing things I've actually heard. Somebody was questioning me on this, and he said, "Oh, but diamonds are inorganic; they're not organic substances." It doesn't matter. That's a moot point. The fact that there's still carbon-14 in the diamond is the issue.
Yes.
Not whether it's organic or inorganic. Now, if you want to find this out, like the Genealogy Institute of America has got a short video. I can post it in the comments later, where they can actually show whether the diamond is from organic or inorganic origin. And it's to do with delta-13 carbon and nitrogen concentrations. But I won't talk too much about that. You can watch the video. I'll post it on the comments section later so everyone can have a look. Okay, so simply there should not be any carbon-14 in a diamond, no matter where it is sourced from. So as I said earlier, usually you'll hear two possible ways a diamond can be contaminated. They'll talk about in situ contamination. Now, in situ contamination means that somehow the carbon-14 has got into the diamond from an external source. But as Professor McQueen can testify, the carbon structure of a diamond is packed so hard that nothing can enter a diamond from the outside except for light and radiation. Which leads me to my second point. Okay, we know that there are trace elements in the diamond like nitrogen, and we've already said to you that carbon-14 can be formed from nitrogen. It is a fact that radiation can react with the nitrogen through neutron capture and convert that nitrogen into carbon-14. However, this has been looked at by the Ray team. Calculations have been done by Dr. Baumgartner and Dr. Safadi, and they have determined that at the very best, about 1 in 13,000th of a percentage modern carbon can be produced from the uranium decay. Here's another fact. Carbon-14, as I've said earlier, decays at 5,730 years. Uranium half-life has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. This fact alone suggests that the carbon-14 is decaying 800,000 times faster than the uranium the uranium decay can actually make it. So it's almost impossible. The method which is currently being used, the most accurate method that's currently being used to measure the carbon-14 in a diamond is the AMS, the mass spectrometer. Okay, so they've determined that at best, the decay from the uranium can actually add 0.0001 percentage modern carbon to the process, okay? Now, the AMS only measures to 3 decimal places. So this is a 4th decimal. 0.0001 is negligible. It makes absolutely no difference to the results. Okay, that's the first point of contamination. The second point that they always point to, if the dates don't come out how they want them, is it must be laboratory background contamination. Let me say this. These are professional organizations. They are run by experienced scientists to ensure accuracy on all the AMS labs. They undertake regular testing to determine this background measure. Now, typical value is around 0.077 plus or minus, I think it's 3 percentage modern carbon. I've heard one lab in Australia, the Canberra, I think it is, they actually have a value of 0.04 percentage modern carbon as the background radiation. Now that you've heard this, the Ray team actually collected 12 different samples. You can put that table SFT if you like, the one of the 12 diamond samples that the Ray actually used. And we'll find here that these samples have had this background so-called contamination subtracted from it. And you'll see those 12 samples and where they were actually sourced from, and their C14 to C ratios, percentage modern carbon on the right-hand side there. Now, for those that haven't got a calculator nearby, but I did this last night. So those values that you see there vary between 70,000 years and about 47,000 years. A mean was determined at 55,700 years. We'll often hear, but that's greater than the young Earth creationist claim of 6,000 years. Well, that's because they actually base that on a ratio, on a C14 to carbon ratio from around about the 1940s, I believe. Now we know that carbon-14 can vary by a number of different factors or events. For example, the strength of Earth's magnetic field can have an effect on it. The atmospheric C14 variation between the hemispheres, the burning of fossil fuels as during the Industrial Revolution cause variations to the C14 in the atmosphere because of human use of fossil fuels. This is called the Seuss effect, and it's decreased sunspot activity included, which is the Maunder minimum. I'm not sure if you follow climate science, but so if you do, you'll notice that term Maunder minimum is mentioned a fair bit. Now, the alteration effects such as fractionation, that is the delta C13 correction, in situ production from nitrogen 14 within trees, C12 added to the tree through the uptake of water from the subsurface dolomitic carbonate soils. This would result in C14 ages obtained, which would be much older than they really are. Recrystallization in shells and the marine effect. I'll give you an example a bit later on about what they did with one of the shells. Volcanic eruptions contaminating the atmosphere, forest fires, sun flares, lightning storms, nuclear testing, all these can affect the rate at which C14 can be made and reduced. Okay, as I mentioned,
let me react to George and then give George the opportunity to react to my geology comments, and then we'll go on to the Q&A time, building up to the end of the first hour. It's very important that you understand what George is saying based on that work from the rate group. He and I have talked about this, so I got out my copy of the rate report, and I have the exact same chart that he showed, except his was right side up and mine's upside down. And the last sentence underneath that chart is so critically important. These data suggest, at least from a statistical standpoint, and he told you about the mean that he was able to figure out, that carbon-14 exists in these diamonds to a high degree of certainty, as astonishing as that may seem. Now, let me make a response to just how that astonishing it is to me. In my undergraduate days, I took a class in archaeology. And over the years, the way I've described the difference between geologists and archaeologists is that geologists deal with minerals, gems such as diamonds and rocks, whereas our archaeologists deal with cups and plates and items made of wood. And in archaeology, carbon-14 dating is generally what people are doing. Now, if you look inside my memory box here, you'll find my patch collection. And here's a patch, kind of a joking patch, talking about the Iraqi Yacht Club, Desert Yacht Club. But this is a reference to the wars that have occurred in the Middle East. Now, if you find that inside of some box, you can have a date. So what if you don't have that inside of a box? The archaeologists have traditionally used carbon-14 dating to say, well, if you find wood from Noah's Ark, we'll just run it through a carbon-14 date. Well, the comments that George just made about the problems with carbon-14 dating just in general from the Industrial Revolution and from other things that George commented about, that's very interesting, and that requires an adjustment. But look at it through the glasses of a geologist like me. The Precambrian rocks in South Africa that these diamonds blasted up through are not just millions of years old, they're billions of years old. The Earth's mantle crust boundary there in South Africa is considered by the evolutionary geologists 1 billion years old. How could you have something that decays, and the half-life for carbon-14, do I recall that it's around 50,000 years, or do I not have that correct, George?
Approximately, yeah.
Okay. But the point is, whether it's 50,000 years or 100,000 years, it is not millions of years.
Correct.
And
correct.
so to find carbon-14 in as durable a mineral as diamond, which is the hardest on Earth, which you can't even imagine contamination going into or out of. Isn't that a remarkable young Earth argument, George?
Correct, David. One of the things as I mentioned earlier, I hear is the 55,000 years is outside the 6,000-year-old Earth.
Right.
To do a quick math, right? That discrepancy is a factor of 8. But when you do it on the secular timeline of 1 to 3 billion years, you get a discrepancy of up to 60,000. I mean, we can account for discrepancy of 8 because it's difficult to do, but we can make some assumptions about the ancient atmosphere and how much C14 and C12 was there, because we know there's I don't know the figures, but there's lots of coal and gas and oil in the earth, buried in the earth. So there was a lot of carbon in the earth previously. And if you care to read that rate report, Dr. Baumgartner actually makes some assumptions and gets a factor of 10. So if you apply a factor of 10 to the 50,000 or to the 55,700, you get roughly 5,500 years.
Right.
Well, even
for people that want to ask me questions, at least, what I want to do is take what George has said about Dr. Baumgartner's work about that factor of 10, but I want to focus on this. How can rocks that are supposed to be a billion with a B,
right,
a billion years old, have a mineral in it that has carbon-14 in it that can only last 100,000 years? I want to draw attention to the enormous discrepancy between deep time and a young Earth.
And this
actually,
and
George,
this is,
if I could jump in here real quick, because I wanted to say a couple things based on everything you guys have been pointing out. So many great points, so much good information, and based on what you just said, George, I find the critics miss the entire point, because as you gentlemen are pointing out, carbon itself decays so quickly that, let's say, if to put it into perspective, let's say every single atom in the universe was made of carbon, and I've pointed this out in the past, it would decay easily within 1 million years, okay? So that means the rocks that the evolutionists or the uniformitarians are pointing to, if they really were millions of years to billions of years old, then they should have no carbon. And the fact that we find carbon in, as Professor McQueen is pointing out, rocks and objects that are claimed to be billions of years old, right? That's and actually with what you were saying, George, even a stronger magnetic field in the past, in the pre-flood world, would affect carbon-14 production as well. So yeah, I just wanted to point out that even if every single atom in the universe had carbon, should be gone within
very good point, standing for truth. Why don't we pause now and give us some questions from the audience, and we'll answer those up to the 1 hour mark.
Okay, can I make one more point? I've heard the argument from I won't mention names, SFT. You know who they are. They've cited and I actually pointed to the Genealogy Institute of America, where they can actually determine if a diamond is organic or inorganic. Okay, depending on the trace elements of the delta C13. They can tell you that it's organic, okay? Then they say to you, well, we know, and they say, they specifically say, we know that diamonds take 1 to 3 billion years. Therefore, life existed 1 to 3 billion years ago. But they neglect, and this is the dishonest part, that they neglect to say C14 is found in the diamond, and it shouldn't be there at all if it's that old. So that's why I say to a young Earth creationist, diamonds are our best friend.
Yes, and I agree. And for those of you that may not remember your college chemistry, what George is talking about is called delta C13, and that's a ratio of isotopes of carbon that I'm not going to talk anymore about. What questions do we have now from the audience standing for truth?
Okay, here's a question as well, and I want to point out one thing as well from some of the comments that I've seen in the live chat and comments in the past is these results from, say, scientists in the rate team, they are repeatable. Okay. And that's the point when it comes to dinosaur bones, fossils, coal, diamonds, fossilized wood, all of these things, it's repeatable. It's not just one or two instances. I mean, this is very significant. So I just wanted to point that out. But a question, Professor McQueen, would be, in your experience studying this topic, you've obviously been confronted with a lot of critics, a lot of old Earth creationists. How do they respond to this evidence of C14 in diamonds? And do you find any of their responses or rebuttals convincing?
Well, let's use the same argument that I would use in teaching my grandchildren about the Bible. My grandchildren might come to me with the Bible passage from the New Testament that talks about the baptism of the dead. And so I would turn to my grandchildren. I would say, well, listen, we have to let the clear teaching of Scripture illuminate the parts that are not clear. That's the only place in the New Testament that it's mentioned. And the baptism of the Holy Spirit, whenever you put your trust in Christ, the water baptism that follows as an evidence of your commitment to Christ, that's clearly talked about. So what the evolutionists use is they use a faith-based religious argument the same way I use it to talk about baptism of the dead. They say, oh, McQueen, let's look at the predominance of evidence. Carbon-14, oh, that's what archaeologists deal with. What about potassium argon? What about uranium lead? What about rubidium strontium? All those dates give millions of years. And so when we walk into the church of evolution and we're using the religion of faith-based humanism, we have to let the clear things, so they would argue, explain the unclear things. They use the same kind of argument that my former boss, Bob Gentry, heard from the 80s on. Oh, your radioactive halos, they're just a tiny mystery. And so they dismiss them and then go on to talk about uranium, lead, and so forth. Previous episodes of Standing for Truth, in those, you've heard George and I talk about the problems with radiometric dating in its assumption and so forth, and specifically about pleochroic halos, radioactive halos, and how that relates to the decay rate. But let's get back to diamonds. Let's not lose our focus. See, the people that have argued with me have considered, oh, these diamonds from South Africa, these diamonds that the rate group got, the diamonds that Dr. Snelling talks about in his 2009 book, these are just outliers, statistical outliers, George, that don't have any significance. Don't you find that a silly way of trying to redeem a worn out idea of deep time by ignoring relevant data?
Well, yeah, I can add a little bit of that. I mean, they fall back on contamination when dates don't agree with them. Well, why do we believe any carbon-14 date then? What makes one not contaminated and another one contaminated? It is just a rescue device, David. That's all it is. No one, to my knowledge, has ever refuted the rate team on the C14 in the diamonds. I've heard Dr. Snelling say that one professor, he didn't mention the name, of a particular university actually did repeat the results, and he was astounded. Nothing was published, of course, because you know what happens if they publish it?
Yeah, exactly. And I have Dr. Snelling's book here, volume 2, and on page 860, he says this: invariably, this supposedly anomalously detected carbon 14 in these procedural blanks. Now he's talking about what George has taught us about the AMS standard way of measuring carbon 14. He says, invariably, these supposedly anomalously detected carbon 14 in these procedural blanks have been claimed to be contamination, which has led to the admission that there appears to be what they call, quote, a radiocarbon barrier of 55,000 to 60,000 radiocarbon years for the apparent ages of even supposedly ancient samples, no matter their supposed age. Do you hear what he's saying at the end there, George? No matter their supposed age. Now, I get excited, even though it's way past my bedtime here in Louisiana right now. I get excited when you look at the geologic map behind me here, and you look at the colors, especially the red colors that are in the middle of that pink rectangle there, and then you go up into above my head in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and over into the Appalachian Mountains. These are clearly alleged and have been since World War II at least of being millions and billions of years old, these rocks. And yet, for example, the this explosive, intrusive rocks in Arkansas that I've mentioned are supposed to be Cretaceous in age. In other words, they blasted through in the Cretaceous time. Well, even if you take that as a benchmark and you look in a Geology 101 book and you look up, well, when did the Cretaceous end? When did the Cenozoic begin? You still have the same discrepancy, George, that we've been talking about between 50 to 100,000 years versus millions of years.
I've got a question here from Org. He's wondering if you could expand on how rate knows that contamination is not a factor. They are just that good.
Well, I think I'll have my say, and then I want George to go back to that chart you had put up.
Yep.
And you can go ahead and put that chart up. That's table 6 AMS that George sent you. And I'll reread what it says there. As a matter of fact, put the chart up and I'll go one page back to read this. Standing for Truth, can you put George's table 6 back up?
Yes. Let me see if let me know. I've got 3 here, so table 6. Which one?
Yeah, that's it right there.
That's the one.
Okay.
Yeah, leave it right there and let me go to page 613 and read you something. Although the carbon 14 to carbon ratios shown in table 6 are small, when the standard background is subtracted away, now this is a standard statistical test that George in engineering and me in geology we've done for years. When that standard background is subtracted away, and in some cases, that standard background is smaller than the confidence interval of the measurements from which they are derived. They nevertheless are all positive. In other words, they're greater than the laboratory standard background value. Now, George and I, in our careers, have been statistic to death. We've been taught a lot of statistics. I know I have throughout my undergraduate and graduate years. And when you look at this this chart here, and you look on the right hand side at that ratio, that you see it starts at the top, 0.0t plus or minus 0.03. When you look at that, that is a remarkable statistical number. In other words, let's say if you go back to me now, let me show you something with my models here. Okay, this hourglass here is not an atomic clock. It's supposed to last for 5 minutes. So if I turn it over and allow the sand to fall down through it, it's supposed to fall in 5 minutes. But yet, if I take my cell phone, which I've got running in the background here, and put it over against the hourglass, there's going to be a standard deviation of error. This thing is not going to measure 5 minutes exactly. It might be 5 minutes plus or minus 5 seconds or 10 seconds. I've never actually measured it. But those of you that are in the Standing for Truth audience that aren't fluent in mathematics or statistics, you might misunderstand the importance of what we're saying here. Can you see my point, George?
Yes, David. The other point I'd like to make is those laboratories that the RAID team used were secular laboratories, and they do regular examinations and tests to determine that background contamination. And as I said, those figures that were up before are actually the figures where the contamination was subtracted from the total. So even when the background contamination is subtracted, there's still measurable quantities of C14 that measure less than the 100,000 years, and they obtained a mean of 55,700 years.
Okay, let me answer Dansman's question.
Yes, that's the next question.
What about carbon-14 that may have come from uranium thorium deposits through regular radioactive decay and would actually get into the diamond? Well, let's use this as an example. Again, this is an example of a kimberlite pipe, and we're using this complicated geologic vocabulary of a crack in the basement. And then what follows, George? Boom! A rapid, huge, well, not huge is not the right word. Rapid is hundreds of miles an hour worth of speed coming up from the lower mantle to the crust. And then let's imagine that where I put the yellow Post-it note is a uranium thorium deposit right beside it. And what we have where I put my finger now is a place where in the late 1800s they found these diamonds. And you can find all over sub-equatorial Africa diamonds. Okay, here is my geologic argument. As George has already pointed out, the crystallography of a diamond is closely spaced carbon atoms. As a matter of fact, it's the hardest substance. It's a substance that until the RAID team began to do their work in the early 2000s, I would have never dreamed could have been contaminated by anything. But I was a young Earth creationist in the year 2000 when I was part, briefly at least, of the RAID team looking at halos. And I would have never dreamed that they could have found carbon-14 in diamonds from a place like Kimberley, South Africa. So my argument, as you say there, is what's the best argument against this? The best argument is the crystallography, the mineralogy of diamonds.
Thanks, David. I think I touched on this earlier, but when this criticism first came up, the RAID team actually went to those specific sites where they sourced the diamonds, specifically to determine what the radiation levels were. And Dr. John Ball Gardner, as well as Dr. Safadi, I've had discussions with them via email, have both done the calculations, and I'll post them in the comments. If you understand a bit of mathematics, they looked at that particular argument, and at best, as I said, the radiation or the contamination based on radiation acting on the free nitrogen in the diamond can only account for 0.0001 percentage modern carbon. That's undetectable in an AMS. Okay, right. So it makes negligible difference.
Understand the importance of what George is saying here. See, that's a geochemical argument. That's a radiochemical argument. So that's step one. Step two is the mineralogy of diamond. You're never going to get, let me get my model here again. If you got a uranium thorium source 100 meters away from where you're finding the diamonds, and I'm of course talking about at depth before it blew up to the surface, that would never be able to go inside of a cubic mineral like diamond with that closely spaced carbon molecules. Simply could not be done.
The other fact too, David, is carbon is decaying 800,000 times faster than the uranium can actually produce it. Yeah. So that's another factor which makes it makes that criticism impossible.
Well, and I want to point out, and George knows, because we are constantly faced with the critics who, even though corrected, even shown that their rescue devices fail, and they've been addressed thoroughly by PhD young Earth creationist scientists, really. I mean, the scientists from the RAID project themselves have looked to all these explanations. And George, as you know, specific critics that refuse to tap out, for example, such as, Gutsick, Gibbon, they'll still repeat the same rescue devices and talking points, even though they've been dealt with. Isn't that right, George? You've noticed that, eh?
Oh, yeah. I've actually even heard reiterate that oil exploration requires dating of the rocks, which we completely debunked a couple of months ago.
But standing for truth, before I take my 1 hour break and let you carry it on, let me make one final comment here, of course, and reiterate something that we've said repeatedly. Evolutionary humanism is a religion. And so we should not be surprised that the critics of the carbon-14 in diamonds would say, oh, you guys, you're always arguing that the clearest scripture should explain the scripture that's unclear when you're trying to find out about baptism for the dead. You got to allow us, we're religious priests. We just wear the black robes, not the white robes. We wear the black robes of evolution. And so you got to allow us, cut us some slack here. We want the clear evidence of uranium, lead, potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium. We want that to indicate deep time. This whole business about carbon-14 in diamonds, that's some tiny mystery that'll be figured out when we get out of Sunday school here at the Evolutionary Church. We'll figure it out. Can you see my argument?
Well said. Very well said, Professor McLean. I completely agree.
David, one of the other things I came prepared, and I think, Standing, if you've got those two other tables I sent you, just put up the one. You don't need the both of them, but
it's kind of hard to see, but I'll do it. Yeah, because I'll show you. I don't know how well people.
That'll do.
Okay, gentlemen, can you drop my video and I'll be back in 5 minutes, please?
Definitely, Professor McQueen. You've earned yourself a much deserved break. I appreciate it. Just 1 second.
Now, there's another part to that table. So the list is actually quite extensive, but they've done carbon-14 testing on all sorts of different materials. For example, they sourced, I think, 10 samples from the US Geology something or other, I forget the name, where these deposits, these samples were actually sealed in drums with argon inert gas to stop this, so there would be no contamination issue as a result. They actually sourced, for example, coal from how many? I forget now. I think there was 10 core samples from core beds ranging from the Eocene to the Pennsylvanian. For those that aren't aware, that represents a 40 to 320 million year old range, okay? When they actually did the testing on all these core samples, they measured radiocarbon levels equivalent to ages of 48,000 to 50,000 years. Please remember that 40 million to 320 million, and all those samples tested at 48 to 50,000 years. None of them were contaminated. They were actually sourced from a US geological organization. And as we, that's a good one, yeah.
Well, George, I just want to point out, everything you're saying, everything that's been said within the last hour. Just remember, critics such as Dodgeball Dan, who earned the Golden Dodgeball of the Year award. So everybody, please thank him. I mean, wow, he's got some master dodgeball skills. And Gutsick Gibbon, for example, I just want to point out the fact that it's obvious to anybody. I think even the atheists at this point, that this is how they examine the evidence. This is how they examine the arguments, blindfolded. So hopefully one day they remove the blindfold when they're actually reading a technical paper, either secular or creationist. We can only hope and pray. Anyways, I just wanted to point that out, George. Keep going, brother.
Yeah, only if they're interested in the truth and they actually want to research the thing. But here's some other stuff that I actually found, that they found fossilized ammonite shells alongside fossilized wood in a Cretaceous layer, supposedly 112 to 120 million years old. They contain measurable radiocarbon equivalent ages of 36,000 to 48,000 years. I mentioned earlier about the shell. If you know how shells actually form, they form in layers. So what they did was they actually radiocarbon dated the top layer, and then they radiocarbon dated the bottom layer of the shell, and they found different C14 ranges. So that's just goes to show you that there are variances in C14 in the atmosphere.
Right. Great points. It's really laughable as to how the critics essentially can just employ the same rescue devices over and over again. For example, Matt and I were working all day on a short video, guys. We uploaded it pretty well right before this program started. So a lot of people might not have had a chance to look at it, but it's a short video on cold slabs. Okay. The confirmed testable prediction made in regards to flood geology. And these cold slabs, okay, this confirmed prediction, it is so funny, because I have witnessed it over the last couple of years of doing these debates, how they have no real rebuttal or objection to it. And all I've seen, George, and you could probably attest to this, the best that I've seen is them just attempting to retrofit or incorporate the data into their story, right? Because it's all about retrofitting the observations, because they're never going to question the bigger picture, the paradigm itself, right? So I just want to encourage people to check out that video after. The evidence for a global flood, the Genesis flood, is overwhelming. Go ahead, Brother George.
Exactly. I actually watched that video just before this stream, and it's excellent, by the way. I'll just add that I think that prediction was made by Dr. Baumgartner, and that particular plate that you showed, I think, was the North American subduction plate. But just recently, I think it was late last year, 2020, they actually found evidence of another plate, the Indian subcontinent subduction plate, also has similar temperature variations to the North American plate. So there's another piece of evidence that supports the prediction about the core plates.
Right. Great points. And once again, that just proves it's not just an anomaly. For one, it was a future testable prediction that was made, like you said, by Dr. John Baumgartner. And then years later, through seismic tomography, they discovered these cold slabs. So it's a fulfilled prediction, right? And they can't really get that, obviously, through their heads. So if rapid plate subduction and the flood model is so wrong according to the secularists, the uniformitarians, and the critics, then why are these predictions working so well? So I just wanted to point that out. We got Professor McQueen back with us. Professor McQueen, we missed you.
Yes, and I went to my shelf, George, and pulled off a geologic encyclopedia that I've used for years, and noticed a couple of comments about diamonds from this. Diamonds crystallize as octahedrons, dodecahedrons, and cubes. Many in the Standing for Truth audience have been trained about mineralogy and may be aware that the cubic system among minerals, 6 or 7 systems, depending on what you look at, is the one that is the most complex. It's the one that has the most symmetry. And I would argue, because of diamond's hardness, the hardest to get into. But since many of these arguments that George has correctly pointed out are red herrings or false attempts to trivialize the data, since many of these are based on temperature arguments, listen to this about diamonds. Diamond has the highest thermal conductivity of any known substance. The thermal conductivity of pure diamond at room temperature is 5 times that of copper. The points of diamonds used as cutting tools do not become hot owing to this very high thermal conductivity. Now, what does that mean about this geochemical argument? Well, I'll tell you what it means. It means that it's bogus. If diamond has a thermal conductivity many times greater than copper, are you trying to tell me that even at the enormous temperatures that the diamonds form at and pressures? Let me give you some examples. For my study this week, diamonds are presumed to form around 15,000 degrees. By the way, when you get that high, it really doesn't matter if it's centigrade or Fahrenheit, but it turns out it's 15,000 degrees. 1,500 degrees centigrade. To give you an example, Hawaii volcanoes erupt at 2,000 degrees centigrade. But the point I'm trying to make is that at those temperatures, you couldn't force any of this nitrogen into the crystal structure. You couldn't release anything. So any carbon-14 in that structure is trapped there by this thermal conductivity argument. Does that make sense, George?
Oh yeah, I've never heard that one, David. That's a good one. I'll use it if you don't mind.
Please be aware that this comes from the McGraw-Hill Encyclopedia of Geologic Sciences.
Oh, McGraw-Hill, yes. Yeah, we've used those reference books.
I would like to make a comment that I hope would spur some more questions from our audience, and that is by using an argument from Dr. Andrew Snelling's big 2-volume book that that talks about the kind of overview, if you will, of carbon-14. Dr. Snelling puts this in a category he calls the pitfalls of radiometric dating methods. This is page 861. And notice what he says here. The radiocarbon, quote, dates equivalent to the significant levels of carbon-14 detected in fossilized wood, coals, diamonds, and other, quote, ancient fossil carbon are, of course, calculated on the assumption that the decay rate of carbon-14 has been constant throughout Earth history. However, if, as other evidence cited previously indicates, there are brief episodes of accelerated nuclear decay during creation and the flood, then the carbon-14 might not track what it is in our modern day. So those of you that have been watching Standing for Truth for a while are aware of what's called accelerated nuclear decay. You're aware of what's called catastrophic plate tectonics. Can you see how this argument that we're giving tonight relates to the argument of accelerated radioactive decay? Now, once again, as a geologist, and I'll let George walk down the other path as an engineer and statistician. As a geologist, what I want you to take away from tonight's class is you've got a substance that is residing at sometime at Earth history at the crust mantle boundary. So it's in an environment where tectonic plates are moving and converging and moving apart. And so you've got catastrophic plate tectonics acting on these areas. And then you reach a cratonic area. And by craton, that's usually a Precambrian group of rocks. For example, in southern Africa, in northern Canada, other places around the world. That's a cratonic group of granitic rocks, primarily, basaltic rocks, that develop a crack, and then this very unique kimberlite comes blasting up, as we've talked about before, coming from the crust mantle boundary, where the black sand is, all the way up to the surface. Don't lose the point. If these are blasting through what are supposedly 1 billion year old granites and basalts, and they're coming up through it, then you have to understand the geology of it, that they are at least as old as the rocks that they're blasting through. Well, some people say, oh, McQueen, what a naive argument. He said, even in your example that I'll point to again here in Arkansas, the traditional dates of potassium argon, radiocarbon, not radiocarbon, but potassium argon and so forth, peg these diamond bearing rocks as having intruded during the Cretaceous period. Well, whether you take my earlier argument about perhaps these being 1 billion years old, or you put these at the boundary between the Cretaceous and the rocks of the Tertiary and Quaternary period, they are millions of years old. And as George has correctly pointed out, the half-life of carbon-14 in the modern context, even forgetting accelerated decay, is 50 to 100,000 years. I challenge my traditionally trained evolutionary geology colleagues to explain that discrepancy.
On that subject, it's not just diamonds that contain C14. I mean, SFT and I had a short discussion while you were away, David, but there are fossils, coal, oil, natural gas, limestone, marble, and graphite from practically every flood-related rock layer, and even some pre-flood deposits have all contained measurable quantities of radiocarbon. Now,
Yes.
all this is it. All these results have been reported in the conventional scientific literature, but you don't hear about it. I'm not sure. I think there was a few years ago, there was an international conference, I think in Singapore or in Asia somewhere, where right at the last hour, a particular report was pulled out of that conference that related to carbon-14 associated with fossilized bones. I'm not sure if you heard about that, but it was removed at the last hour. They are afraid of all this stuff.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And let me relate an experience I had in the previous century, in about, I guess it was 1997, perhaps. I was at a Geological Society of America meeting in Salt Lake City, giving a paper. And I went to the radiometric dating section. Now, I wasn't presenting a paper there. I was presenting a paper regarding the geology, what I took to be flood geology of coastal Peru in another session, but I went anyway. And so they had a fellow there that had borrowed the very beautiful red robes of a cardinal, and he pretended he was Bishop Usher. And they had a lot of fun talking about 4004 BC and how Bishop Usher believed that the earth was 6,000 years old. They made fun of it. Well, let's see them dressed up in an Elvis Presley diamond-studded white lame garment, and let's see them make fun of this diamond argument and carbon-14. See, they're not going to do that. They're going to want to dress up like Bishop Usher and be critical of a 6,000-year-old earth.
Oh, yeah, I agree. There was one question that came up, David. Maybe you can touch up on it. From Crimson Air. He says, does uranium decay faster in molten form? Well,
I can go back to my work 40 years ago at Oak Ridge National Labs with Bob Gentry. He and I had spent a lot of time talking about the decay of U-238 and how it would decay down through the polonium series all the way to lead. And it turns out that if you heat up uranium, you actually don't change the decay rate that much, because the decay rate is insulated, if you will, from temperature and pressure. Now, there was a time in the scientific research bearing on the young Earth argument, there was a time in the 50s and 60s and 70s where a number of scientists thought that if you could modify the physical properties of uranium, like taking U-238 and squeezing it very tight or heating it up very much, that you could actually change the decay rate from a half-life of 4.5 billion years to something else. There's no indication that I know of that that can modify the decay rate. So the critique of uranium-lead dating is the same three-part critique that was actually worked on by the late Dr. Henry Morris in the 50s. And that is, you've got a problem that you don't know There's no way to prove that the decay rate has remained constant with time. Secondly, you don't know what has been added and subtracted through geologic time, the addition of uranium, the subtraction of lead. And then thirdly, you don't know initial conditions. You don't know how much U-238 was in the rock to start with from creation. And so those three problems negate all of the radioactive dating methods.
And we know for a fact that uranium leaches in soil. So you're right about what you say. You don't know what the initial conditions were because you don't know whether uranium has leached into a sample or out of a sample. So yeah,
I've got a question.
Yeah, now we do have to be careful there, George, because remember our focus tonight is diamonds.
Yep.
These cubic, very hard crystalline structures. What you're talking about is the leaching of uranium from a hydrothermal brine that would get mobilized during the flood in the western United States and would actually form what are called roll front uranium deposits, where that uranium would actually go into a fossil log or something. So you're quite right. Uranium can go and it can form even secondary polonium halos for that matter. But that's a topic for another time. Our point needs to constantly come back to the fact, okay, you high priests of evolutionary humanism, explain to me how nitrogen or some delta carbon 13 isotope can even get into the crystal structure of a diamond when it's forming at the crust mantle boundary under tremendous pressure, 1,500 degrees C. Come on.
Yeah, my point was about the radiometric dating, David, and how inaccurate it is.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true.
Right.
But David, did you know? Do you know I was driving down the road with my daughter a couple of weeks ago?
Yes.
And the Sweet Caroline came on the radio, and I said to my daughter, "This is a little known fact." I said Neil Diamond used to be called Neil Cole. Until the pressure got to him, of course.
Oh, very good. Mrs. McQueen loves Neil Diamond, and that brings me to one of the lessons of being married for almost 50 years. There are those that love Neil Diamond, and there are those of us that don't.
Nah, I love him. I've got Hot August Night is fantastic.
Well, we've got a comment, maybe more of a critique from the audience.
Okay.
They are saying that, I think in response to some of the points being brought up. So Andrew Cumming, thank you for your comment. We appreciate it. He says initial conditions are not necessary for radiometric dating techniques. And even so, we have ways of correcting for it. What would be the best response?
Okay. May I go first, George, and then you can help Brother Andrew understand in addition. What he's talking about here is if you go to an area like the Grand Canyon and you look at the lava flows which flow over the edge of the Grand Canyon down, Dr. Steve Austin, back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, he sent blindly a number of these rock samples from the lavas to different labs. One lab looked at uranium lead, one looked at rubidium strontium, and all of the labs used a technique of correcting these geologic ages to bring consistency. Now, why were they worried about consistency? Well, that is a very interesting point and perhaps a topic for a future discussion. But in brief, what it is, Dr. Austin sent those samples to a number of different labs And they did the exact same rubidium strontium test, and there were hundreds of millions of years discrepancies from the rock samples themselves. And so the ability of these labs to use what Andrew comments about, we have ways of correcting for it, was proven by Dr. Austin to be wildly, I'm tempted to use the word irresponsible, but I don't want to lay too much of a burden on these labs. The labs earn their money by making sure that the data that they turn out fits into the overall billion-year-old column for the rock record. And so obviously they can't stay in business if they report to Harvard and Yale, University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin, University of Queensland. If they report, oh, all that you sent me supports a creationist viewpoint of a young earth, they're not going to stay in business doing that.
Yeah, Dave, you took my thunder, but I hear this kind of argument a lot, where they say different methods corroborate the results. No, the particular example that you mentioned, they sent those samples to different laboratories using different isochron measuring methods, and
Yes.
they all got different results. So how could they corroborate each other
Even
if
on
they're getting
isochron.
different results?
Discordant dates, even with isochron, which they claim. For example, here's a question, and we spent a lot of time on this in the past, so we don't have to rehash all that. But of course, it's a typical rebuttal to everything we're saying. Andrew Cumming, thanks so much for the questions and comments. He says, can you please ask Dr. McQueen what his thoughts are on isochron dating then? And as George was pointing out, even isochron, which they say removes some of those assumptions, come back with discordant dates.
Well,
Correct.
let me respond to Andrew in two ways. First of all, because of my viewpoints about a young earth, I was never allowed to get a PhD from Michigan. So Professor McQueen will do. I don't have a PhD. But here's something that you should look into. If you get volume 2 of the RATE project and look on page 495, you'll find a whole chapter on what's called isochron discordances, inheritance, and mixing. And here's one example that the RATE team put together. For the purposes of this present study, the Apache group basalts and the diabase sills were sampled from road cuts along hellways. This is standard geologic practice. The basalt flows between the algal and argillite members, those are two types of sedimentary rocks, of the limestone were sampled in a road cut south of Globe near the wall of the Roosevelt Dam. This is figure 34. Let me find it here. Oh, I can't find it quickly. But anyway, this is the western part of the United States. At the latter location, a full sequence of detail, it comes down to this conclusion. These sills intrude between lower Churty dolomite and algal members of the Mescal limestone and the overlying Devonian Martin Formation, the Troy quartzite being in this section. And this is quoting a report from 1989. Why would that be important? Well, if you're going to look at isochron discordances in a group of rocks intruding into Devonian strata, then those results should give you a result younger than the Devonian strata. Why? Because the old geologists had a standard rule. Rocks are laid down flat. They might be tilted during orogenic events, but the old Scottish geologist always said, if you have something intruding in a flat-lying rock like this pin going up through my fingers here, that's the law of cross-cutting relationships. So this has got to be younger than that. So there's a whole book, Andrew, about tremendous problems with isochron dating and how it fits into the evolutionary framework.
That's a great response, Professor McQueen, as always, incredibly detailed. I want to point out to George, I think this is a question pertaining to some of the comments you were saying earlier. The question is, were the isochron lines in all the examples, George, were they linear? It looks like Andrew is wondering.
That I claimed. I'm sorry, but I don't know the answer to that, unless David can elucidate a little bit.
Yeah, let me look up let me look up the answer there for a minute. Let me find what Dr. Snelling says in his chapter here. I'm going back to chapter 6, isochron discordances and the role of inheritance and mixing of radioisotopes. Listen to the first sentence of his abstract here on page 393. New radioisotope data were obtained from 10 rocks units spanning the geologic record from recent to early Precambrian. So this is going back 600 million years, 700 million years. 5 of these rock units being in the Grand Canyon. And then what is his conclusion in looking at these isochron discordances? Here's what he says at the end of that abstract. Very long sentence. Let me struggle to find the beginning. Here we go. Furthermore, because each of these 3 assumptions of conventional radioactive radioisotope dating, we've already talked about them, known additional condition, closed system behavior, and constancy of decay rates have clearly been shown to be subject to failure, the radioisotope methods cannot and should not be relied upon to produce absolute ages. So whether you're talking about isochron dating, discordances, the inheritance of certain uranium-lead isotopes from a previous magma, or the mixing of one magma with another, no matter how you play this soccer game and you move the ball all the way down the field, you're not going to score a goal. Why? The same problems that underlie traditional, let's say, uranium-lead dating apply to all of these isochron discordances too. Page 393 and 394 in volume 2 of the rate book.
Oh, I apologize. I was on mute.
So
Thanks
that's
again.
why
Yes. Thanks again for that response, Professor McQueen. George, if you had a response, I think there's some echoing coming from your end, George, because I muted you. As Professor McQueen was talking, there was some echo. Looks like it's gone. So whatever you did, you fixed it. Did you have a comment? And then I had a question of my own before we start winding it down. We're coming at the 2-hour mark. So George, the floor is yours if you had anything you want to say.
Yeah, well, they've done isochron dating on what known 20th century lava flows from, forgive me if I mispronounce this, it's in New Zealand, Mount Nagaruhu. They gave results that were like some 3,000% different from one another. So, go figure that one, Andrew.
Here's my follow-up to that. I've heard this in response typically from the critics, Professor McQueen and George. I've heard it from some specific critics that have criticized us too. They'll say you can't take rocks of known age or rocks that, were just formed, say, from recent lava flows. They say you can't do that honestly because you'd expect erroneous dates, they say. You just can't do it. They'll point out. I've heard that over and over again. I mean, what are your thoughts? Have you guys heard that at all?
That's because it disagrees with them all every time.
Yeah. Let me use this medal from my military military science collection. My dad served in World War II. Many of my friends served in Vietnam. And if you were in Vietnam from the 60s up through the fall of Saigon in 76, you were allowed to wear on your uniform this Vietnam medal demonstrating your presence in that war, police action, whatever you want to call it, from the mid 60s up through mid 50s, rather, up through 75. Now, let's say that we find this medal in a lava flow in Hawaii. If we find this medal in a lava flow from Hawaii, we know that it was awarded after the war was over. So we know that this rock, this lava that it's contained in, would be older than, I'm sorry, let me make sure I've got saying this right. If this metal was in the lava had to flow after the fall of Saigon in 1975. Well, you can use a similar geologic argument. Some of these lava flows that occurred in Hawaii and were observed by Scottish Presbyterian missionaries there in 1850, 1870, and so forth, they've gone back to flows that they know happened in 1870, and they give a date of 1,000,000 years or 1,500,000 years or something like that. The point is these historical flows, when they're dated, show very young dates. Now, what's the standard evolutionary attempt to get the soccer ball down to their end of the goal, their end of the field, rather? Well, the standard argument is, McQueen, you get those much older dates, not because of the Vietnam War, but you get it because that lava has incorporated older rocks, and the fools that collected the samples for radiometric dating simply didn't know what they were doing, and so you get an older date. Well, is that true, or is there a real discrepancy in these dates? I think the answer is that there's a real discrepancy.
Well, I just want to point out, George, that was really helpful and a great response, Professor McQueen. So it sounded like when I brought up that criticism, you have heard it before, because that was a very good response, very helpful and beneficial to myself, and I think the audience too. So, George, the floor is yours, brother.
Yeah, just to finish off, David, when you were getting a coffee, SFT and I were discussing another part of the rate team where they sourced 10 core samples from various locations ranging from uniformitarian ages of 40 million to about 300 million. And all coal samples measured roughly the same carbon-14 dates of roughly, from memory now, I think it was 38,000 to about 44,000 years. So even when you look at their own uniformitarian assumptions of coal of different ages, they all date to similar C14 dates.
Yeah, that's true. A chart on pages 594 and 595 of volume 2 of the rate book draw comparisons between the present modern carbon and the number of samples that have been sampled in this example that you're giving here, carbon-14 to C ratios. And so as you go and look at the actual data, you come away with an argument that I would like to make my final comment to our standing for truth argument, our standing for truth audience. Our critics constantly say that people like Dr. Andrew Snelling and Dr. John Baumgartner and Dr. this and Dr. that might have been exposed to the truth at UCLA, or might have been exposed to the truth of the Australian university that Andrew Snelling got his degree from, but they rejected the truth. It reminds me of one of my favorite stories. When I was at ICR in the mid-'80s, one of the scientists there was Dr. Ken Cumming, who had a degree in ichthyology from Harvard, of all places. And so when Dr. Cumming would go out and debate, he would debate people from Yale or MIT, and they knew his credentials. He had a PhD from Harvard. At the end of the debate, they would say, well, Dr. Cumming was at least exposed to the truth.
Right. David, I'd like to know, with these secular labs that do the dating, why do they ask you to fill out a form and request that you tell them what you think the age of the rock is? That's ridiculous. Yeah. They're supposed to tell not the other way around.
Well, it reminds me of... I was just going to point out, it kind of reminds me of this comment from Andrew.
I saw that, yeah.
And once again, thank you to anybody in the chat, whether you're a creationist or you hold to evolution. We always appreciate your comments, your objections, criticisms. That's what we like here: healthy dialogue, healthy debate. Because he pointed out one must choose the appropriate rock samples before you determine the age of the formation. So for one, I'd say, these rocks of known age are coming up with discrepancies. But let's take rocks of unknown age. Yes, if you want to take that over.
Yeah, I too appreciate Andrew and what he said. But let me make it clear to the Standing for Truth audience that I've never actually done the math, but I'm quite sure that on the North American continent, including Toronto, Canada, and all the labs in America, I'm pretty confident that there are less than 100 laboratories that earn their living by carbon-14 or rubidium, strontium, potassium, argon dating. And so the jobs of these individuals, I'm sad to report, Standing for Truth, that a lot of things always seem to come back to money. But the jobs of these labs depend on conformity to deep time. They depend on conformity to standard evolutionary arguments. So if I submit a sample from the Cades Cove area of the Southern Appalachian Mountains, the lab is going to want to know, well, okay, Cades Cove is a overthrust area of Precambrian rocks that's overthrusted over some Cambro-Ordovician rocks. So they're going to want to know where that came from. Why? So when they get the 5 different dates that are not concordant, right, they can go to this map behind me. Get my head done right. This is the King and Beitman map of the geology of the United States. And they can look on that map and say, oh, here's where McQueen was. He was in this part of the Precambrian. And so any date that they get us that's 5 years or 7,000 years, they throw that out and they pick a date that meets the geologic paradigm behind me.
I I love that comment by Crimson Air. You got to give it a star there, SFT.
Yeah, that's why I put it up there.
Pin a star.
George? Hey, George, did you want to read it out?
Oh, yeah. This is Crimson Air, David. It says this is to Andrew Cumming. Yes, care must be taken to select rocks of unknown age in order to be able to assume that the dating results of millions of years is correct. Classic. Thank you.
Yeah. Sadly, because in a few months I will turn 69 years old, and so I have learned over the last 50 years the number of things in science that revolve around money and keeping your job. Well, it's certainly the case that if any radiometric dating lab, carbon-14 or uranium lead, was shown to provide evidence that proves a young Earth idea, they would go out of business. And that's the reason that my colleagues, when they were doing the rate study back around the year 2000, they very carefully chose people like John Doe and Mary Doe to send their samples to the lab. They didn't want the lab to know that a bunch of known young Earth creationists were submitting their data there. Makes sense, doesn't it, George?
Yeah, and the other thing, as you know, that rate study does not mention the labs that did the testing by name for obvious reasons.
Yes, that's true. And the problem that we have now in the 21st century is that if you and I, George, were able to get $1 million grant from somebody, and we wanted to go back and reproduce some of the results from the rate study, because of the internet and people being able to Google David McQueen's name and find out that you're related to James Bond, George Bond, once they discovered that kind of thing, you and I wouldn't be allowed to submit these samples. They would say, we noticed that you sent your request in on yellow paper, not white paper. Please resubmit in 20 years on white paper. So that's a kind of runaround that we would get, you see.
I know. What I get this a lot when I give them like irrefutable arguments. The very end is like, no, you're lying for Jesus. That's the argument they give me.
Right. Yeah. No counter rebuttal or criticism. Just, we're lying for Jesus, even though this is all evidence directly in the rock. So it comes back to the.
By the way.
Yeah, go ahead, Professor McQueen.
Yeah, by the way, Don DeYoung is a longtime friend of mine, going back into the 80s. And this is a great comment that he makes here. The wives of everybody on that rate team were very sad, because in order to do that carbon-14 study on diamonds, they had to crush these big diamonds. Ouch, he said.
Yeah.
Diamonds are supposed to be a girl's best friend.
Right. Right. Actually, one question I had from earlier, maybe we could start winding it down here. I know how we like to shut these down at roughly the 2-hour mark. We're at 1 hour and 51 minutes, and so much good information. We've still got over 30 people in the chat. I think we've kept roughly 30 plus people the entire time for 2 hours. So it's an incredibly interesting topic. And as the title suggests, it really is a young creationist best friend, because we've thoroughly dealt with the majority of the counter rebuttals, the criticisms, the objections. My question to you, it's kind of slightly off topic now, because it was a question pertaining to something we discussed earlier. But your thoughts, Professor McQueen, if age is derived today, okay, if they assume that the Earth's magnetic field has always been constant, when in fact, we've discussed it in the past, evidence suggests that it was stronger in the past and therefore protecting the atmosphere from solar radiation. The question is, would this mean, or would this at least indicate that past animals, past creatures had much less radiocarbon in their bodies then as a result?
And, this argument, and let me find my blackboard here, or in this case, whiteboard. If you draw on the y-axis, if you draw on the x-axis time, and on the y-axis, you begin to talk about carbon-14, many creationists will draw the diagram this way, with this breakpoint being about 4,000 years ago. Let me hold this up to the camera here. Often, many creationists will draw this figure and say, at the time of the flood, roughly 4,000 years ago, we don't fully know what the carbon-14 amount was, but we know that carbon-14 has been decaying in the wood of trees that Shem, Ham, and Japheth planted as they got off the ark, and as we move up to the time of Babel and the dispersion all over the world. And so it is the case that many people that have thought about how we could determine the age of wooden artifacts from before the flood have struggled with this. And the perfect example is Noah's Ark itself. Over the last 1,000 years, there have been numerous sightings of the Ark on the mountains of Ararat. And certainly since around World War II, there have been a number of attempts to say, well, let's go find the Ark and actually find out what the gopher wood is, do a radiometric date on the gopher wood, and see whether it shows up being a falsification from some wood that was used in construction in Roman times, let's say 100 BC, or if it really could be a wood that's very old. Well, again, this type of argument from archaeology is a topic for another time, but I hope you can see how that argument revolves around knowing how much carbon-14 there might have been in the pre-flood world. And so it's a big deal. It really is a big deal.
Right, yeah. Right. Thanks for the answer, Professor McQueen. George, if you had any comments, and then I think it must be getting pretty late for Professor McQueen. We are now going on the 2-hour mark. Lots of good questions, lots of good comments. I wish we could do this all day, but of course, time is a factor. Therefore, George, if you had anything you wanted to say, and then maybe, gentlemen, we can start wrapping things up.
I just wanted to thank David for his input today, and hopefully your tests come out positive or negative, David.
Yes, how very true. As a grandfather of 9 grandchildren, it's almost 10 o'clock Central Time here, way past my bedtime. But it's been exciting to be part of this. For heaven's sakes, I may stay up an extra 15 minutes or so. But for now, I'm going to leave the studio and pray God's blessings on the Standing for Truth argument.
We'll see you soon, David.
Standing for Truth audience. Good night, gentlemen.
God bless, David.
God bless you, Professor McQueen. So I got to say real quick too, is I'm really pumped for a lot of the discussions, debates that we have for the month of March, because Professor McQueen being so knowledgeable, we're going to be having him and Jordan from Reason to Doubt, who recently debated Kent. Jordan focuses on, decay rates and nuclear engineering. So that's going to be a lot of fun. A fun discussion on accelerated nuclear decay. We also pretty confident that we've chosen who we want for a debate with Joseph Hubbard. We've had a lot of people interested in it, but we definitely wanted to choose somebody with more experience who's had debates in the past. So hopefully we're going to talk to Joseph Hubbard and hopefully get that figured out. Also near the end, actually midway through the month, I think it's March 18th. I got to check my schedule. We've got T-Jump's going to be here debating Bill Morgan, creation versus evolution. So that's going to be a lot of fun as well. And George, any thoughts, brother? I think that was really comprehensive. And I personally haven't seen any solid rebuttals coming from the critics to these fascinating lines of evidence. It really just demonstrating in young earth. Go ahead. The floor is yours, brother. Go ahead.
The only critique came from Talking Origins, I think it was, and that was debunked. So really, I'd like to plug, though, come this Saturday. Is it this? I think it's Saturday for me. I think it's Friday for you guys. We have creationist John McKay with Dr. Diane Eager. We're going to talk about fossils and the flood. They've got a lot of experience. They found a lot of fossils. And another plug, I've been speaking with Michael Ord. We're going to have Michael Ord, I think it's April the 5th for you guys, April the 6th for me. Yes. So he's going to give a comprehensive sort of presentation on the Ice Age. So that should be good.
Yes. We've got Mike Ord. It feels like yesterday that he was here giving us his presentation on the recessive stage of the flood. We had an awesome question and answer. We went for almost 3 hours, I think. So I am pumped. Yeah, we're having him back on for another extensive presentation on the Ice Age, but I want to point out another Q&A. So make sure you're here, guys. And one thing I'll say, George, and then the floor is yours, is here at Standing for Truth, behind the scenes, you know, we are working overtime to get you these great shows, debates, discussions, interviews. One thing we are working on is hopefully by summer, because the months fly by. Okay, so March, April, May, probably, hopefully, maybe even in May, we want to have a Standing for Truth creation conference. So we're reaching out to a number of speakers. It'll probably be a 3-day event where we've got 2 or 3 speakers per day. Therefore, I want to point out that we appreciate all your support. If you want to help us make that happen and you want to consider supporting us, you know, definitely hit that donate link. We appreciate any support because you guys are the life and blood of this channel. And oftentimes these events take a lot of time, work, and energy to get the best speakers and to host. Go ahead, George. Go ahead.
Standing, you're in trouble. All these celebrities I've been speaking to have said to me the only reason they tune into the channel is because of all my jokes.
Yeah, it's the only reason I haven't shut down the channel yet, because I look forward to it every show.
Anyway,
joke?
Hey, by the way, you owe me lunch. I haven't had lunch yet.
I told you. Hey,
it's 3:10.
Yeah. We got to have some pizza together, brother. The first chance I get, I'm hopping onto a plane. I'm in Canada, you're in Australia, and we're gonna have some fun.
Oh, you're on, but just beware. We have pizza and beer. Okay.
I don't know if I can handle that.
You have to wash it down with something. All right, mate. It was nice to talk to you.
Good to talk to you, brother. Always a pleasure. I'll see you on WhatsApp soon. But anyways, I want to thank everybody in the chat. George, as always, laughter is the best medicine, and you are the team comedian, brother. I love you.
God bless everyone in the audience.
God bless everybody. Thank you for the good show. Pass around, share around. We want this information to get out to as many people as possible. So everybody, we'll see you tomorrow night. Matt Slick versus Derek Barnes. Should be a good show. Should be a big show. We'll see you at 9:30 EST. SFT is
out.